Today's daf is daf mem, and we begin with Matan Arba Minayin Talmud Lomar Kein Yaseh. So we're going through this brisa, and the brisa is analyzing a pasuk in the fourth chapter of Vayikra, which is addressing the case of Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, and there's some extra words in the pasuk, and the brisa darshaned a lot of these words. In fact, the main emphasis here is on what's called Matan Sheva. And Rav Papa had said earlier that we have two precedents for Matan Sheva, and they are the Paraduma and the purification of Tsaras. Maishna Matan Sheva. Why is it necessary, to present an exposition in order to derive the conclusion that with regard to the chatos pnimios, which number 5, and the zrika sadam has to be on the four corners of the mizbach hazov inside the heichal, why do we need a special drasha to teach us that these 4 matanos are critical, and that the hazos in which the dam is applied require 7 hazos? Maishna matan sheva dechsivan ukfelon. So we can certainly derive the conclusion that the matan sheva, that the 7 hazos towards in the direction of the paroches inside the heichal is absolutely critical. And we know that because we have a principle in Kodshim that whenever the Torah repeats itself, it's telling you that it's critical. And therefore the Matan Zion has been repeated, and therefore it certainly is Likuva. Matan Dalid Namik Sivan Ukfila. In the case of the 4 applications of the dam on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach in the Chatas Apnimis, that also is written twice, and therefore that would already establish that all 4 applications on the 4 corners of the Mizbach Hazov are critical, and therefore I don't need that special drasha of Kein Yaseh. Omer Rabbi Yirmiyah, Lo Nitzcha El Rabbi Shimon. We're going to have here machlokas now between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about how to derive conclusions regarding the 4 applications of the dam on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach, as to how we derive that. And we're going to have in the Brisa one approach of Rabbi Shimon and another approach of Rabbi Yehuda. The commentaries point out that there's not a machlokas here between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. They're not arguing in halacha, they're only arguing in how to derive halachic conclusions from scriptures. The Sanya we learned in a Brisa, Lamala Omer Keren Kronos. Okay, so now we're talking about the par lechatos of the Kohen Gadol. And again, just to reiterate what we said yesterday, if the Kohen Gadol was a scholar and he ruled for himself an erroneous halachic ruling of very severe nature, and he violated that law, then he has to bring a chatos, and that chatos is a par. And in the parsha, right there in Vayikra Dalid, with regard to the applications for the par shel Kohen Gadol, the Torah already tells us that you need 4. 4 is the minimum, the critical minimum. How do we derive the number 4 according to Reb Shimon? And the answer is because there's Keren Kronos and again Keren Kronos. So twice the Torah uses the plural and indicates that you need at least 2 applications on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. And Lamatu Omer Keren Kronos. So Lamala is referring to, as we said before, the chatas of the Kohen Gadol, the par that the Kohen Gadol brings for his violation, and Lamalta is referring to the par helim dover shel tzibur, which is also a par. And in both cases, the Torah uses keren ukronos, as we have here v'nosan hakohen min adam al karnos mizbeach. So again, the plural is used here. And a little bit later on, it says, Min Adam Yitain El Kardos HaMizbeach. So Kardos is the minimum of a plural is two, and the other two of Kardos, again, in the case of the parallel of Dover Shel Tzibur, is another two. So both Kronos in the plural teach me 2 plus 2 is 4, arba. So therefore, if we already have, according to Rabbi Shimon, a source for deriving that the four applications on the four corners of the Mizbeach are absolutely required, they are critical, then we don't need any sort of a hekesh in that pasuk of Kein Yaseh. I call it Kein Yaseh, but it's a longer pasuk. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, I have a more basic, straightforward source for the conclusion that you need arba chronos, because Hareyu Omer, right, with regard to again the special korban chatos of the par of Kohen Mashiach, of the Kohen Gadol, it says be Oel Moed. And the pasuk says, V'nosan, where is it? Asher Pesach Oel Moed. And what do we derive from the Oel Moed, says Rabbi Yehuda? Al kol ha'amur be Oel Moed. In other words, whatever is essential to the Oel Moed, namely the Mizbach Hazav, then the four corners of the Mizbeach are indicated by Oel Moed. Again, later on, the Gemara is going to raise the question, why doesn't Rabbi Shimon use the pasuk Oel Moed, and he's going to derive something else if the roof fell off, whatever. But right now, we see that clearly Rabbi Yehuda derives from B'chol HaMoed, the Oel Moed, excuse me, that it means that the dam has to be applied to all the chronos of the Mizbeach. Rabbi Shimon, on the other hand, right, he's of the opinion that neither the case of Oel Moed above or Lamata Oel Moed, in either case, it's not a source because I need the Oel Moed for some other din. And therefore, Reb Shimon would certainly have to employ the drasha of Kein Yaseh to teach you that all four matanos on the four corners of the Mizbach Hazav in the case of Achatas Primis are critical. So the Gemara says, wait a second, are you telling me that according to Rabbi Yehuda we could derive the essential status of all four matanos in a Chatas Primis from Oel Moed? So then we're back to square one on Kein Yaseh, because Rabbi Shimon had used Kein Yaseh to derive that conclusion. So therefore the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yehuda Kein Yaseh Mai Ovidle, what are we meant to derive from those words in the Torah, Kein Yaseh, according to Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Shimon is understood because he's going to derive from Kein Yaseh the requirement of a minimum critical four corners, but Rabbi Yehuda doesn't derive it from that. He derives it from Oel Moed. So the Gemara answers me, he needs it for a different halacha. Wow, now we're getting to smicha. And lefishalo lamadnu lepar yom hakipurim lesmicha lishari adam. All right, so now we're introducing another par. Until now, we've been speaking about par helik dover shel tzibur and paro shel kohen mashuach B'Shemen HaMishcha. And now we're introducing another par, besides the par Helim Tov Shel Tzim and the par Shel Kohen HaMashiach. We're introducing now the par of Yom HaKippurim. Now let's keep in mind that out of the 5 chatos pnimios that are brought into the Heichal, 2 of them are specifically on Yom HaKippurim, and they are the par and the soyer. Later on in today's daf, we're going to compare the two, the par and the soyer. But now we're focused on the par. And the question is, does the par of Yom HaKippurim require smicha? And with regard to Shiori Adam, does the leftover dam, in the case of the Chatas HaPnimis of the par Shel Yom HaKippurim, does it require what we call Shvicha al Yisod? How do we know this? And again, the Gemara doesn't tell you what the Havamina was, but apparently the Torah never tells me, never spells out, shall I say explicitly, that Smicha and the Shvichas HaYisod, which were formulated in the Torah in the context of the Par Helim Dov Shel Tziva, should apply to the Par Shel Yom HaKippurim. So therefore, in Par Shel Yom HaKippurim, how do we know from whence to derive the conclusion that there's a requirement of smicha and there's halacha of shvichas shiorei adam al yisod mizbeach? Talmud Lomar Kain Yaseh. So what does Kain Yaseh do according to Rabbi Yehuda? Kain Yaseh is going to compare the par of Yom HaKippurim to the par of Helim Tov Shel Tzibur, and in the par Helim Tov Shel Tzibur, the Torah spells out explicitly that you require both smicha and shvichas dam al yisod. So the Gemara raises the following question now: Ulapar Yom HaKippurim lo lamanu? Is it really so that we haven't derived the conclusion of smicha and shvichas dam al shiorei adam al yisod mizbeach with regard to the par of Yom HaKippurim? That's not so. Ha'amrit lapar ze par Yom HaKippurim. Right, we had a brisa that said, and this we quoted earlier on Daf Lamed Tes, that from the word lapar, we're going to derive the par of Yom HaKippurim. And that teaches us that the par of Yom HaKippurim has the same status as the par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur. And that should already establish and derive the conclusion that you need smicha and you need shvichas shirayim. Itzvah. Or says, no, we need the pasuk of Kain Yaseh. Why do we need the pasuk Kain Yaseh? I would have entertained the possibility. If not for the pasuk of Kain Yaseh, then Hani Mila, okay, now we're going to divide up the avoda into 2 categories. There's the avoda which is ma'akeves, esa kapara. It's absolutely critical for the carbon to be kosher and generate kapar. And then there are avodos which are, shall we say, above and beyond the essential avodos, and they're not critical. They are sort of like the cherry on top. And salkedait chamina hani mili. When do we equate the par of Yom HaKippurim with the par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur? That's only bi avoda de me'akve kapara, that avoda which is absolutely critical in the avoda and the kashrus and the validity of the carbon. Aval avoda de lo mi'akva, for example, smicha and shvichas dam al yisod, which is lo ma'akva, those are additions beyond the kaparas hakarbon, is emelo. I might think that the whole requirement of smicha and shvichas shirayim al yisod, which is formulated in par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur, does not apply to the par of Yom HaKippurim, which, by the way, is very paradoxical when you think about it. I mean, the whole purpose of smicha is to achieve kapara, to recite vidui, and what other karma would be paradigmic of kapara if not for the par of Yom HaKippurim? I mean, that would seem to certainly require smicha. I don't know about shirayim, that I don't know. Kamash Malan, therefore the Torah tells me according to this drasha of Cain Yasalo, that what? That smicha and shvicha shirayim are required even with regard to the par of Yom Kippur, not just in the par helim dovashal tzibur. Now, you may recall that Rabbi Shimon needed this drasha of chronos, 2 plus 2, to derive the conclusion that the four matonos on the four side are critical. And yet Rabbi Yehuda argued I can derive that conclusion from Ol Moed. So Gemara immediately turns around and says, Rabbi Shimon, hi Ol Moed, my Aviv. What's Rabbi Shimon going to do with the pasuk Ol Moed? And the answer is the question of the roof of the Ol Moed. Be Ol Moed mipoile, we need an ohel. Now, what's an ohel? An ohel is a tent. Now, why does a person put up a tent? He needs something on top of his head. There's no such thing as an open-topped, right? What is called those convertibles, the open-top convertibles, whatever they were called. Yeah, that's not called an ohel. You want to build an ohel on the back of, like the Chabad sukkahs, that's okay, but an ohel requires a roof, and therefore the Torah added B'Ol Moed to teach Shem Nifcheta Tikra Shel Heichal Lahaya Mazeh, that the whole process of Hazah and the mitzvah of Hazah is contingent on the fact that there is a roof. But if there's a breach in the roof, then there's no Hazah. The Kohen would not sprinkle the dam. Now keep in mind that the Heichal in the Beis Hamikdash was a parallel to the Ohel Moed in the Midbar. If the ceiling of the Heichal were breached, again, I don't know what breached means. It could be Daled Amos, it could be Shlosha Tvachim. I don't know what breached means. But in any event, it's no longer called an Ohel. An Ohel has to have a covering on top. And again, we're talking about a Chatas Pnimis, and the Torah says Ol Moed. As far as a Chatas Hachitzon is concerned, I don't know if the fact that the roof over the Heichal is breached would have any what's the word, inhibition regarding the ability to do the matonos on the chronos for the Chatos Hachitzon. The Idach. Now, what do we do with Rabbi Yehuda? I mean, after all, Rabbi Yehuda has to come and give us a cheshbon, a nefesh, to calculate from whence are we going to derive the conclusion that the Heichal has to have a roof on top of it. And without the roof, there's no azah of the Chatas HaPnimis. He can't derive it from Ol Moed because he needs Ol Moed for the Chatas HaChitzona. For the Chatas HaPnimis in terms of the Matan Domin. And the Gemara answers me, Asher. Now, this is really interesting because there really is an obvious repetition in the pasuk. It's so striking. The pasuk says, listen carefully, Min Adam Yitain al Kardos HaMizbeach Asher Lifnei Hashem. So again, it says Asher, underline that word Asher Lifnei Hashem. And then the very next word is Asher B'Ol Moed. Another time Asher. Totally superfluous. You could literally erase that word. If you had if you could project the Tanakh onto a screen, just simply erase that Asher, and nothing is lost. So the extra word Asher, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is going to teach me that if it's not Asher, it's not, Asher means to emphasize, it's got to be this, an ohel. And it can't be a breached roof. V'idach. So now the ball goes back into the court of Reb Shimon. And why does Reb Shimon need Ol Moed to derive the conclusion that the that if the roof is breached, then there's no hazor of the chatas pnimis. Why doesn't he derive from the extra word asher? And the more answers asher lo dorish. That somehow it's within the framework of the way people speak and the way people write to add the word asher. It's not considered an obvious, blatant, superfluous word. Okay, now we said that the brisa relied on this drasha of kasher of Kain Yaseh to establish that the four matanos are critical. Why do we need that? Why not derive it from that rule that whenever the Torah repeats itself, and the Torah with regard to the matanos of achatas pnimis repeats itself, shana lava kosav likuva, that itself proves that it's critical. So by Omar Rabbi Yehuda Nami Itzrich, that in fact Rabbi Yehuda also needs this drasha of the brisa, and despite the fact that Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you can derive from Ol Moed that you need all the zrikos of the Ol Moed, all four. Salka, I would have thought that maybe as far as the four corners are concerned, we're not going to apply the principle of Shina HaKosav Olav Le'akev. Why? In the case of Smicha and Shari Adam, the Torah repeats itself, and yet, Afalga, Diksiva Nukfelin Loma Akve. And why is that? Because Smicha is just an elaboration or an extra cherry on top. And Shari Adab is already after the Zrika and the Mechaper. So the carbon is already kosher. Is now Matan Arba Nami Lotis Akev. Maybe we would say that just like we saw already in Chatas Chitzona, that all you need is critical is one matana, and therefore in Chatas HaPnimis, maybe one matana should be enough. And if one maton is enough, then the other three matonos have the same identical status as smicha and shfichas dam b'shiarim, because we've already established based on the precedent of chatos chitzona that these last three zrikas are not critical, and therefore comes under the category of avoda deloma akfe. And when you have avoda deloma akfe kapara, then you don't apply the principle of shina olav hakosav liak. Okay, we go on in the brisa that we've been studying now for a blot and a half almost. Lapar zepar yom hakippur. Right, so we said there were two unique karbanos with very unique avoda on Yom Kippurim. That's the par and the sa'ir. Okay, so now we have a drasha lepar ze par Yom Kippurim. What is that telling me? What is it about the par of Yom Kippurim that I don't know, and therefore I derive it from the extra word lapar? The Ma'ilchus. Ili akev. If it's coming to teach you that even with regard to the par chatos on Yom Kippur, we need all four zrikos, and that's li'ikuva, is pshita. I know it from another source. I don't need the extra word lapar because chukah ksivaba. The Torah used the word chukah. And let's see the pasuk. It says in Vayikra Tezayin, it says v'hoisa zos lachem lechukas olam. And that's the avodah of Yom Kippurim with all the applications of the dam, whether it's the dam on the mizbeach in the four corners or whether it's the dam keneged aparoches. So again, once we have the word chukah, I don't need this extra joshua par to teach me that the par Yom Kippurim requires all the avodos. We know it requires all the avodos because chukah ksiva ba. It says chukah. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak lo nitzcha el Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. So now, Rabbi Yehuda is going to introduce a fundamental distinction or categorization between two types of avodos of the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur. And they are the avodas pnim and the avodas chutz. The Kohen Gadol had an amazing job, very complicated job on Yom Kippurim. He had to wear special begodim, which are called bigdei lavan, when he did the avoda bifnim. And not only that, there were certain avodos that required bigdei lavan even bachutz. So Nitzchah says Rav Nachman el Rabbi Yehuda the Omar ki ksiva chukah. Now we have the word chukah here. What kind of, let me say it this way, to which kind of avoda do we apply the rule of chukah? Right? Chukah means it's absolutely critical, it's essential. Is advar manasim b'bigdei lavan b'fnim. We would assume that the word chukah, which again applies to avodos of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim when he's wearing bigdei lavan, but maybe it's only those avodos that are done in the Kodesh Kadashim, which is called in the Gemara's language bifnim. And this has to do with Haktores. It has to do with the sprinkling of the dam hapar and the dam hasoyer. So those were done with bigdei Kohen Gadol, but lifnim. Lifnim means lifnai v'lifnim, in the Kodesh HaKadosh. Avol dvar manasim b'bigdei lavan b'chutz. Okay, the Kohen Gadol is still wearing the special begodim for Yom Kippurim, the bigdei lavan, but he's doing now avodos b'chutz, outside of the heichal. For example, the zrika of the dam. I'm sorry, did I say outside of the heichal? My mistake, I meant to say inside the heichal, but outside the Kodesh Kadosh. I'm sorry. The sprinkling of the dam of the par and of the soy towards the paroches and on the mizbach hazov, all that is nase b'chutz. Chutz again in this case doesn't mean chutz lazar like it usually means, but rather chutz lekodesh hakadoshim. Okay, now I left out a few words here that are critical. I apologize. Let's go over it again because I skipped a few critical words here. The Omar, this is Rabbi Yehuda's statement, ki ksiva chukah, when does the term chukah, which teaches me that something is absolutely essential, when does that apply? That's only advar manasim bigdei lavan lifnim. Oh, now these are the words that I skipped. She'im hiktim ma'aseh lechavero lo asva lo klum. Right, the Torah specifies for all these avodos a certain sequence, and that's called a seder, and that sequence is absolutely critical. For example, the Kohen Gadol first enters into the Kodesh Kadoshim with the Ketores, he leaves it there, then he brings in the dam of the parachatos, and he sprinkles it towards the covering of the Aron. Then he brings in the dam of the chatos sa'ir, the seir lechatos, brings it towards the Aron, or actually the cover of the Aron. Right? And this all requires a certain sequence. If the Kohen Gadol deviates from that sequence with regard to avodos of Big Day Lavon Lifnai V'Lifnim, then it's Ma'akev. The entire avoda is disqualified. But when it comes to those avodos, Big Day Lavon, Bachutz, again, what does Bachutz mean? In the Heichel itself. And there had to be certain hazoyos in the direction of the kapores or the one second. All right, it'll come back to me. Hikdim Maisel Chavero, if he switched the order and he brought that which was meant to do later, he did it earlier. There, the halach is Masha Asa Asui. This is the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda, that if he violated the sequence of the Avodos outside of the Kodesh Kodashim, the Big Day Love, with regard to all the sprinklings on, the Kaporas and the Parochas. Sorry, that's what I had forgotten before. They're so similar in terms of the letters, Kaporas and the Parochas. So that would not upset the Avoda, and the Avoda B'diavad would be Ksherab, even though he violated the sequence. So now we see that there's already a fundamental difference between the Avodos in the Kodesh Kodashim Big Day Lava and the Avodos outside in the Heichel of the Big Day Lava. And his aim, I would have entertained the idea that me, the Kesidron Loma Akve, Hazos Nami Loma Akve. Wow, this is a very heavy Havamina. It's unbelievable. The Havamina is that if the Kohen Gadol omits some of the Hazoyos, I don't know how many of them, I'm not sure, but outside the Kodesh Kodashim, then it would still be okay. And he could go and finish up what he started. Kamash Malan. Therefore, since in the parsha of what? Of Par Helem Dovashal Tzibur, there's a remez to what? To the power of Yom Kippurim, and that's going to teach us that all the Hazoyos of Yom Kippur, with regard to the power, they're all essential, they're all likuva, even if it's done outside the Kodesh Kadosh. So again, now there's a tzvei dinim over here. As far as Seder is concerned, outside the Kodesh Kadoshim, Seder is only l'mitzvah l'chatchila and not likuva. But as far as the actual sprinklings of the dam on the kaporis and so forth and so on, those are absolutely critical. And that's derived from the structure of the hekesh between the par helim dovashal tzibur and the par of Yom Kippur. All the blood sprinklings of the par helim dovashal tzibur are essential. And by virtue of the hekesh, all blood sprinklings of the Yom Kippur par are essential. It is only the sequence of those done in the Heichel outside the Kodesh Kodashim that is not essential. So Baruch Hashem, we got through that. Maskiv lo Rav Papa umi matzis amris hachi. Are you telling me that there was a havamina that the applications of the dam of the Parashal Yom Kippur would not be ma'akev, and I need a special hekesh to par helim dovashal tzibur in order to derive the power of Yom Kippurim that all azos are liakriva. V'asanya, we learned in the Brisa Now this price is going to present the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. And this machlokas is not just in how to interpret scriptures. This is a machlokas la'aloch la'maisa. Because the Torah says, let's see if he tells you where the pasuk is. In Perek Tes Vav of Vayikra. I'll just read it to you. It says, Perek Tes Zayin. It says, V'kilo mechaper es hakodesh, etc. Now, the word kila means to complete something. And the word keeper means the avoda. All the avoda that's necessary in order to get to kila. To get to kila means to get to the point where there's a kapara for the sin. Im lo keeper. But if he didn't perform the avodos, Rabbi Akiva understands that there's no complete kapara because he didn't do the keeper. So how do you get to the kila? Amalo Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, and he says, "Mipnei malo nomar." Why don't you interpret the psukim in the following way? Im kila keeper, v'im lo kila lo keeper. So what's the difference now between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda? He points out here that Rabbi Akiva maintains that the pasuk means to teach that the acts which are essential to kapara in other places are essential here. Those that are not essential to kapara in other places are not essential here. So therefore, the 7 sprinklings and the 4 applications on the 4 corners of the Mizbeach, which are essential in the case of the kapara of Chatas HaPnimis, are essential to the atonement of the Yom HaKippurim Par and the Soyer. The Kohen Gadol has not finished the atonement unless he did those atonement procedures, meaning all the 7 sprinklings and the 4 corners. However, the pouring of the Shirayim, which is not essential in other cases, is not going to be essential in the case of Yom HaKippurim Chatas, if the Par HaChatas of Yom HaKippurim. So let's say, for example, the Kohen Gadol somehow neglected to be shofech the dam on the yisod. Nevertheless, the carbon would be kosher. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda and he says, no. The verse mentions v'chiper and v'kila, and it's going to teach me that in kila kiper, that if the Kohen Gadol completes all the procedures, then he has effected kapara. So all the procedures in the pasuk are essential to the kapara of Yom HaKippurim through the chatos, the par lechatos, even if they weren't essential in others. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, if the Kohen Gadol neglected pouring the remnant dam onto the yisod of his bath, the carbon would be possible. But again, the whole machlokas here between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Akiva, which is not to be sneezed at, it's an important machlokas, is with regard to shvicha shirayim al yisod, whether it's likuva in the chatos primis of Yom HaKippurim. But both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Akiva agree that the pasuk will at least teach us that the 7 hazoyos and the 4 matanos are absolutely essential. So therefore, since we derive it based on this pasuk v'kila mechaper es hakodesh, and that means that anything that is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, will be essential on Yom Kippurim. Now we're going to take that and we're going to apply the principle of equating the par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur with the par of Yom Kippurim. But why is it necessary? Why do I need that hekesh between par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur and the par of Yom Kippurim to teach me that all these applications, meaning the dam, are essential? And what do I need that for? Why do I need that hekesh? I just derived from the kilo mechapes hakosh. Amar Papa lo nitzcha elo le'es badam ubitfila. Those are three different halachos that are derived from es and badan. And so now, in the parsha of Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur, the Torah alludes to the par of Yom Kippurim, and that hekesh between the two parim establishes that both of them are subject to these three halachas of es, bad, and tefillah. Because in regard to the par of the Kohen Gadol, the Torah states v'tavala kohenes etzba'o badam. In the Yom Kippur passage, it doesn't say any of this stuff here about v'taval etzba'o badam. Those are completely omitted in the parsha of Par Yom Kippurim. All it says is v'lakach midama par v'hizo be'etzba'o. So therefore, if we go back to the parsha of Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur, where there's a remez to the par of Yom Kippurim, we're going to be able to establish a hekesh. Now, through this hekesh, we're going to derive three laws. One is es, the other is badam, and the third is betfilah. Now we go through it. Es Omar of Acha Bar Yaakov lo nitzcha el lahachshir